brief note before we begin this episode. It was recorded many weeks before it was released publicly, meaning our conversation took place before the ceasefire agreement that was widely reported on January 15th. Initial reports indicate a multi-phase ceasefire agreement, including a release of many people, Israelis and Palestinians, who will be able to return to their families and homes. We celebrate this de-escalation of violence and hope that it endures. We continue to hold deep hopes for a brighter future for Palestinians, for Israelis, and for their loved ones around the world.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 468, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're welcoming back Peter Beinart, who was part of the first series of episodes we did on Israel-Palestine and American Jews a number of years ago. Back today for the third conversation in our current series exploring American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. Peter Beinart has just published a new book entitled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. In the book, he offers, quote, an alternate narrative for Israel-Palestine, which would draw on other nations' efforts at moral reconstruction and a different reading of Jewish tradition. The book is now available wherever books are sold. It's a provocative title and a deeply thoughtful and deeply Jewish book, and we're excited to dive in. Before we do, just a few more words of introduction. Peter Beinart is professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He is also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, an MSNBC political commentator, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He also writes the Beinart Notebook newsletter on Substack. In addition to Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, Peter Beinart is the author of The Icarus Syndrome, A History of American Hubris, and The Crisis of Zionism. After graduating from Yale University, Peter Beinart studied at University College, Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, after which he became the managing editor of The New Republic, then senior editor, and from 1999 to 2006, he served as the magazine's editor. Peter Beinart has written for The Wall Street Journal, The Boston Globe, The Atlantic, Newsweek, Slate, and The New York Times, among many other publications. He has also appeared on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Charlie Rose, Meet the Press, many other television programs, and the only one that I'm really jealous of, The Colbert Report. He has now reached the pinnacle of his career as a returning guest on Judaism Unbound. So, Peter Beinart, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you again.
Thanks for having me.
Well, on this podcast over the years, one of the themes that we've talked about has been reimagining Jewish practices of various kinds, Jewish holidays, other practices. And when we talk about that, we often start by saying, well, what is this holiday really about? What are we trying to remind ourselves of here? And how might that translate into new practices? And I don't know if you want to go into the ritual reimagination part of that question, but I wanted to start with something that you do talk about in your book, which is that we're approaching the Purim season here. And you really start early on in your book talking about the holiday of Purim as relevant to this set of questions that you're asking about being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza. And I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners a little bit of that thinking about Purim in particular.
Sure. So, Purim is the holiday we read the book of Esther. And obviously there are many, many things one could say about the book of Esther and its relevance, fascinating book, a book which doesn't mention God, a book in which the Jews are actually quite highly assimilated in some ways, in which they're living outside of the land of Israel. The point I tried to make about Purim in the book of Esther has to do with the way in mainstream American Jewish discourse the story is understood, what we notice and what we don't notice. In my experience, the story is told in which the Jews face destruction, genocide, and then they survive. And that's a partial truth about the story, right? There is Haman who has genocidal plans vis-a-vis the Jews. The Jews do survive, but they don't only survive, right? There is also a reversal of fortunes, right? And Purim is famously about this idea of reversal of fortunes. And in this reversal of fortunes, the Jews, under the leadership of Mordecai, don't only survive, the book of Esther, near its end, ends with these series of massacres by Mordecai and the Jews of Haman's people. Now, There are kind of sophisticated defenses of that you can argue.
And not just Haman's people, like people in all of the provinces.
Right, throughout this vast, right, from Hindu to Kush, basically like this massive, massive empire as far as basically the entire world that can be imagined at this point, right? Now, there are people on the right, on the far right, particularly in Israel, but also the United States, who notice that ending and actually revel in it. Baruch Goldstein, famously, right, the murder in Hebron in 1994, he does so on Purim, right? And there's academics who have studied the use of Jewish violence on Purim going back even to the Middle Ages. And then there are also sophisticated commentators who argue that this act of massive violence in which 75,000 people are killed by the Jewish forces, that it's justified. It's an act of self-defense. The king is a nebish. He can't protect you. This is the only way and you're going to be able to survive. But the point that I really wanted to make in the book is that I think in mainstream American Jewish discourse, this ending is neither celebrated nor justified. It is ignored. And so the story is put into this prism that we put many Jewish holidays into, that as the old joke goes, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. It's a story of victimhood and survival, and that story of victimhood and survival is a kind of template that tends to dominate American Jewish discourse in the way we think about Jewish practices and holidays, and then also it gets transferred onto the way we think about Israelis and Palestinians.
So can you talk a little bit then about what is the alternative story that you're giving here? And essentially, let's talk within the Jewish readership of the book. What are you hoping that they will, at least let's start with think before we start talking about do. Right. How will they think differently about that story or just about what's going on in Israel and Palestine today?
My hope would be that people would read the final chapters of the book of Esther and be troubled and have questions and want to engage in a dialogue and say, should we really be celebrating this? Should we be, waving our groggers and getting drunk? Or should we be actually, is this tragic or is this even extremely disturbing? I suggest in the book, maybe the end of the book of Esther should be read in the trope of Eicha, that we read the book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, a trope of mourning.
There are folks who do this, by the way.
Right, and there are famous stories, right? Famously, there were people who refused to celebrate Purim because of this. There is this tradition of Jewish anxiety about Purim, but I don't think it really penetrates the mainstream American Jewish consciousness. And to me, that very sense of being deeply disturbed and troubled and thinking about us as human beings who have the capacity to suffer tremendous violence and persecution, and also because we are human beings like everybody else, have the capacity to inflict great suffering and violence, something that our tradition is aware of, that I think then gives us a broader spectrum of ways in which we understand what's happening in Israel-Palestine. As I think instead of what I find is so often done by American Jewish organizations, basically whatever happens in Israel-Palestine is forced onto the Procrustean bed of this narrative, right? The narrative is we are oppressed, we are victims, we face genocidal enemies, and our responsibility is to survive, and essentially the question of of the moral responsibilities we might have as people who can inflict great, great suffering and violence ourselves is kind of taken out of the frame.
So I'm really glad that this conversation has already mobilized two words that I think are pivotal to conversations about Israel-Palestine, and they are story and narrative.
Right.
I actually think that when we think we're talking about politics, we are, but often we're talking as much about story and about narrative, and we're really talking about collective stories.
Yes.
Because Esther, it's a story that we tell in rooms of people with choreographed actions and noises and programmed responses.
Yes.
Frankly, I am part of that group that has the anxiety about Purim. So part of this comes from being in an interfaith relationship, and people talk about December dilemma and like Christmas and Hanukkah being a hard time or something for interfaith families. I have found that in my relationship, it's a much smaller problem than sitting next to my wife in a room full of people relating to the Purim story and its ending. That is, as you just described.
Should we call that March Madness instead of the December dilemma?
I love college basketball, so it hurts my heart to do that. But actually, yeah, March Madness, that's pretty good. That's hard. I still remember vividly the first Purim experience that we had where we really interacted with that story. And we were both, first her and then me, in tears at the end of it. We were it happened to be we were in an environment that was not asking particular creative, progressive questions about it. We were in a pretty traditional kind of context for Purim, which was awful for somebody who's not Jewish, who you get to the end of the story and it's like, oh, yeah, we killed all these people. Exactly as you said. Now let's have the Suda. Let's eat. Yes. It's mortifying. And like that word mortifying, it comes from the Latin, like death. Like it is deeply horrific. Shouts to the Chapter 9 project, by the way, from the Shalom Center, that has done some really creative things with that part of the story. But I want to just sit there a little bit more because you do such a good job in your book of sitting with story. Not just Jewish story, by the way, also for you, story connected to South Africa. I mean, that's also Jewish story, but like, I want to ask you, like, what are some ways in which story for American Jews and beyond is playing a pivotal role in how we are or are not able to reckon with Israel-Palestine?
Yeah. I mean, look, maybe this is just a universal truth that people always tell stories to make sense of the world around them. And then these stories have very profound political implications. I mean, I think this is the central theme of Ta-Nehisi Coates's book, that came out last year, The Message. And I think that, so a lot of what I was really grappling with in this book, and the reason I read this book was, to me, the story that I was hearing about what was happening in Gaza, and even what happened on October 7th, to me seemed just to misunderstand. And the story seemed to me to be a kind of an exercise in collective moral evasion. It was a story that gave people license to essentially not have to really grapple in their heads, or maybe even more importantly, in their hearts, with what Israel was doing. And indeed, what Israel had been doing for a very, very long time. And because I think the stories that would help us, in my mind, better explain the relationship between the people of Gaza and Jews in Israel are stories that are very unsettling for us. But in general, those are not the parts of our tradition that we turn to. So, for instance, after October 7th, one of the things that I noticed immediately was the endless use of this phrase pogrom. This is a pogrom. And it's the largest number of killing of Jews since the Holocaust, right? Pogrom and Holocaust. So this needs to be immediately taps into a story. What do you need to understand about this horrific act of violence? This was a horrific act of violence that targeted civilians in horrifying ways. To me, that is not a subject of debate, right?
You're talking about the October 7th.
October 7th massacre, the slaughter of soldiers, but many, many, many Israeli civilians, right? So to me, the question is not, is this wrong? It is wrong. I have very little patience for people who would justify targeting of civilians under any context, right? But when you say the story of this is connected to the Holocaust and the story of this is connected to pogrom, you are putting it now in a context in which the Holocaust and the pogroms are taking place within a context in which Jews are oppressed. Jews are basically stateless people at the mercy of regimes that can be quite predatory towards them and have the capacity to inflict these terrible acts of violence. And that act of violence is connected with the fact that Jews don't have basic rights, that Jews are not really empowered politically, right? All of those things. And it just seems to me that the conditions that exist in Israel-Palestine are completely different than that. These are conditions in which it's Palestinians in the Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, who live as stateless non-citizens under the control of a state that has life and death power over them, which they cannot influence. It's Jews who have legal privilege. Indeed, to use a term that I know some people, grates on some people, I would say legal supremacy, in the sense that Jews have rights that Palestinians don't have, even inside the Green Line, where Palestinians have citizenship. Now, that doesn't mean that Palestinians cannot commit acts of terrible violence against Israeli Jews. They did on October 7th. They have for a long time. When one understands that terrible violence, one has to understand it within the context that exists, which is why I argue that there are other analogies, whether it's the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya or terrible violence during the Haitian Revolution or violence by Native Americans in the 19th century United States, that are better analogies for what happened on October 7th, to understand, not to excuse, but to understand. But these are analogies and stories that we just don't engage with when we think about the role of Jews in history.
Yeah. And by the way, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who you mentioned, he talked about Nat Turner as another potential parallel of somebody from American history, maybe more familiar to a lot of us, as an example of another horrific act of violence targeting children, people who were not legitimate targets of violence within a context where Black people were enslaved and lacked human rights. So I really appreciate the way you help broaden our scope on all of this. For so many of us, and I think this is to some degree a bigger problem for folks in the United States. We're really bad at knowing anything about the rest of the world that is not our own context. And so I guess another question that I would have on that story front, I mean, it continues with the Esther piece. Eternal victimhood. I happened to read your book for the first time right as Wicked was coming out. And some of our listeners have seen the movie Wicked, some haven't. And it was really a wild experience, and I'm going to spoil it a little for those who haven't seen it. But there's a lot of people who see Wicked, which was made by, a lot of the plot was created by a Jew, Stephen Schwartz. And it's very much coded, the one of the main characters, Elphaba, as somebody who is stigmatized, marginalized in her society. And there are all these ways in which Jews have seen themselves present in her story. And then there's another character, Galinda, who is in the first story of The Wizard of Oz, the good witch, but in this story is less of a good character. And her main through line is that she tries to find safety through relationships with power. And her famous song, Popular, it's all about popularity and being connected to people who have power, and that's what the important things are in the world. And again, on the story front, I find it so, sad, interesting, fascinating that we as Jews, I think it's not even that we don't notice that could be a Jewish story too. I mean, we live in a world where Jewish organizations have crafted their strategies around relationships with powerful people. It's dangerous to say all this because there is anti-Semitism in the world. I understand all that. But these are explicit strategies of Jewish organizations to build relationships with folks in Congress, with people of power, with all of that as a way of achieving our safety. And that's a Jewish story, but we don't notice it in the same way we ignore the end of the Esther story. And so I'm curious specifically on the front of victimhood and power. I think it's less that people see what's happening in Israel-Palestine. There's actually a non-compute where people look at videos on screen, and they are convinced from the get-go that it actually can't be. It's a non-compute. It's like when you plug in a formula on your calculator dividing by 0 and it freaks out. How can we relate differently or more thoughtfully to victimhood and power?
Yeah, I think you've described exactly the kind of thing that I've really been struggling with, in which I just walk around sometimes and I think, are people not seeing what I'm seeing? The things that I'm seeing are driving me crazy. They're torturing me. They're haunting me. Again, and everyone is I go through these Jewish institutions, and everybody is operating basically as they were before. But they're focusing a lot of attention, reminding themselves what happened on October 7th and talking about the plight of the hostages and of Israeli soldiers who killed. And I'm not against any of that. I think we of course should be remembering the hostages. We should be praying for the hostages. We should be mourning the deaths of Israeli soldiers. We should be remembering. I'm not against any of that. But when it comes to the exclusion, or the conversation about anti-Semitism, which often to me, and there is real anti-Semitism, and there are problems that exist for Jewish students. I don't want to deny that. But it's almost as if, when people talk about what's happening on college campuses, they talk about it as if, in the mainstream Jewish space, as if there's nothing of significance going on in Gaza that anyone might be upset about. It's that basically all these students on college campuses woke up one day and decided they wanted to make their Jewish classmates feel miserable. And sometimes they are making them feel miserable, and sometimes they're being assholes, and sometimes they're even being anti-Semites. But there's also something going on, right, which Amnesty International, right, one of the world's most premier human rights organizations, has now called a genocide, right, which Omer Bartov, right, the Israeli-born Holocaust historian, has called a genocide. Even Boogie Ya'alon, pretty hawkish Israeli former defense minister, has called ethnic cleansing, right? And so it's the refusal, the unwillingness to engage with these things. And part of what the book tries to do is to argue that there's a series of rationalizations that people go through, things that they throw out. The numbers are fake, right? We can't trust the Hamas health ministry, or it's just because human shields. Basically, they killed themselves because Hamas implanted themselves in these hospitals, or it's their own fault because they elected Hamas. And one of the chapters of the book, I just try to kind of go through these things and say, if people actually really spent a little bit of time looking into these, they would find that these things actually collapse very quickly, right? These don't actually justify the fact that that in Gaza now, almost all the hospitals, almost all the universities, almost all the agriculture, almost all the banks, that basically almost all of the things that you need to sustain life have been destroyed. None of those things actually can justify this. But what they are is they're a defense mechanism to keep us from having to question the story. Because I think for so many of us, the story is what encases our life. It's what gives meaning to our life. It's the way we think about who we are as Jews in the world. And that story, it seems to me, therefore becomes a way of perpetuating this horror, which I think we will be thinking about and talking about for generations and generations. It's of that scale.
So I kind of have a Russian doll worth of questions here, and I don't even know quite how to get at them in the right order. Fundamentally, what I am curious about is, what would it look like to have the conversation with people who don't agree with you that you wish you could have? Because there was a part in your book where you say a set of points, and I'm like, wow, I'm really curious what the other side would say about those points, because you made a bunch of good points. And then you say, right after that, you say, well, if I were to make these points to somebody, and I have many times, I know what the response would be, and it would be sort of obfuscation and changing the subject and talking about, but what aboutism? So I'm curious about, what could be a better way? Because I think people tend to imagine that what an advocate wants, and I mean, to a large extent, this is true, is they want everybody to agree with them, and then everything will change in the direction that the advocate wants. But there's a realism that I think you're asking for, and I'm certainly asking for, a better conversation and an ability to confront realities. And that's where, for example, I actually found Ta-Nehisi Coates' interview on Ezra Klein's show really affecting, because there was a particular point where Ta-Nehisi Coates is describing the things that he sees in the West Bank, that Palestinians have to ration water because the water gets turned off, and so every Palestinian home has a water tank on the top. And Ezra Klein is saying something along the lines of, well, what about sort of exploring the Israeli side and why this is the situation? And Ta-Nehisi Coates says, I don't accept that. Essentially, he's saying nothing could justify this.
Right.
And so he's not necessarily denying that there are reasons why. He's just saying, okay, so let's accept as a given that these bad things have happened. What's the appropriate response? So I guess what I'm asking is, when you're thinking realistically about Jews in America, and maybe a little bit, not realistically, but a little bit, hopefully, how could we talk about this stuff and really sort of confront the fact that, the Palestinians have done horrible things, Israel's done horrible things. So now that we've put all that aside, could we just actually have a conversation about what's happening? And what would that look like?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess I would hope it could start by people trying to imagine or creating the circumstances in which they could look at the stories of what's happening in Gaza, say one particular story that they hear, let's say of people who've been displaced from their homes multiple times, or spending hours and hours and hours just trying to find enough food to feed their families, have lost dozens and dozens of relatives, are now living in tents, are now seeing that those tents are being flooded by rains, and that they could imagine themselves, just like we always can imagine ourselves. When we think of the Holocaust, we think about pogroms, we kind of imagine, us being in those circumstances, or our relatives, and sometimes our relatives were. And the reason I think it's so important to meet and to listen to Palestinians is then I think one starts to be able to imagine, wow, this person really isn't very different than me. And so if this person is going through that, I could be going through that. I don't think very many people would say that they don't really see Palestinians as human beings. Of course we see them as human beings. But when you only think of people in the abstract and you don't actually connect to them at a personal level, at a few meetings, I think that you aren't actually truly seeing them as human beings. And then I think it seems to me what I would hope is that once you could feel at a more visceral level the horror of that, of what is happening, then you might say, gosh, the bar for justifying that is really high. You could say, I'm not a pacifist. You might say, I still believe that Israel has the right to use violence in circumstances. But for me to support this, I really have to think it through. Was there no other alternative? Is this actually necessary? Or are there other ways of treating these people? Because what I find so frustrating is I feel like the defenses that are used to justify these things are so casual, involve so little research and thought. They're just, to me, like people ticking off a box. Human shields, numbers are false, Hamas Charter 1987, like a series of things you hear over and over again. And I rarely find that I actually think people have really actually spent much time looking into these things, right? Because my basic intention in the book is that there is a better way. At its most fundamental and kind of childlike, it's to say that Palestinian and Jewish safety are interwoven. They're inseparable. That if Palestinians are more safe, and if Palestinians are able to have a vision of gaining freedom and being able to live free lives as Israeli Jews do, that is actually the single best way of safeguarding Israeli Jewish safety, having the things that Israeli Jews want and deserve. I guess from starting it for that human recognition, I would like then people to be able to think backwards and be able to open their minds to ways of responding to Palestinians which don't simply imagine that essentially Palestinians are a nail and we have the hammer of overwhelming military force and we're just going to beat them down into submission. It's horrifying, and I also think it doesn't work.
So I'm curious about your take on why that conversation seems to be practically impossible. I have some speculation. I mean, I'll give you two speculations, and then I'm really curious about your take, both on my speculations and are there others? I mean, one, and I think you talk about this very clearly in the book, that it's fear, that people are afraid, and I think they're afraid of two different things. Maybe they're related, but they're afraid that Jews are going to be killed,
right?
The Jews in Israel. They're just afraid if we criticize Israel in any way or open the door for sanctions or anything, like Israel's going to be functionally unable to protect itself, and horrors will ensue. But I think there's also fear, and I think you write about this really eloquently, there's a certain fear of looking myself in the mirror, right? That if I were to admit some of those things that are happening, it would have to change the story of who we are, who I am. And I'm not able to do that. So I'm protecting myself by denying all of it. I'm sort of protecting myself from having to confront the possibility that we have done something wrong. I've never had that fear because I just assume that all people are bad. I just, so then, including me, like I'm always the first to say like what I'm doing bad. And so I struggle a little bit to empathize with it, but I understand that it's there. And I think it's a serious thing that we should talk about. So one is, on the one hand, there's fear. And on the other hand, and this is about tactics, there seems on both sides to be a sense that it's actually good to accuse the other side of terrible things. The charitable view of it is that somebody will wake up. If you tell me that I'm engaging in genocide or you tell me that I'm engaging in apartheid, I'll be like, oh, maybe I am. Like, I got to change, right? But I think that, at least in my experience, a lot of times when you accuse people of a kind of moral failing of that kind, which everybody agrees is a moral failing. I mean, if you're a racist, everyone agrees that that's horrible. If you're engaging in apartheid, I think everybody would agree on that. So the only thing that they can say to protect themselves is like, no, I'm not. And the question for me is whether it's a better tactic to accuse, because the same thing is happening on the other side in terms of anti-Semitism, or it would be better not to use that language because maybe from a dictionary definition, I mean, look, in some cases it's more obvious, in some cases less, but genocide, for example, there is a dictionary definition of genocide where you could arguably say that that's what's going on. Right. But most people understand genocide in a different way. And so when Israel's accused of genocide, they say, that's not how I understand genocide. So they basically say that that's a smear, it's a denial. So I'm not sure that it's working. Right. And I'm wondering if it would be better just to say Israel's doing really bad things, really, really, really bad, instead of having to label it. So I'm wondering if that's contributing to or harming our capacity to actually talk to one another.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting on these terms like genocide and apartheid, right? They both have very specific meanings that I think one can argue. But I actually think in a way what the function they play in the conversation is just as signifiers of something that's really, 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 really bad. Kind of like the worst thing that you can do. And I think part of the reason that people respond so viscerally is that I think the discourse that mainstream American Jews want to have is, sure, Israel's not perfect. Israel makes mistakes, but that there's a bright line between Israel and the really bad governments, right? I think that's what people mean when they say, why aren't you talking about Syria? It's generally not that they really know much about Syria, or frankly, that I think they're particularly interested in Syria. I notice that people generally want to talk about Syria only when someone else wants to talk about Israel, right? I'm like, you could be focusing all your time on Syria if that's really what you're concerned about, right? But it's like, I agree with you that there are a lot of people who get their back up with these terms. And I would say, as a general rule, what I find is the most valuable is to try to describe at a human level what I think is happening, right? If someone doesn't like the term apartheid, I would say, okay, listen, my understanding of the situation in the West Bank is that Jews and Palestinians live next door to one another. The Jews have citizenship. They live under civil law, which means they have due process. They have basically free movement, and they have citizenship. Their Palestinian neighbors have none of those things, right? They can't become citizens. They can't vote for the government that has power over them. They need a military pass if they want to travel, right? So you can find what term you want to, and that means that in every engagement between an Israeli Jew and a Palestinian, the Palestinian is likely to lose because the state is not accountable to them, while the state is accountable to their Jewish neighbor. So to me, this seems to me a situation that produces tremendous suffering, and it is a situation of profound inequality and oppression. If you don't like the term apartheid, you're welcome to come up with whatever term you want, but what I'm interested in is, do you deny those facts, and do you think this is okay? That, to me, I find is maybe a more helpful way with people sometimes, because I think that sometimes I find that people actually don't spend that much time actually just thinking about what these realities are like for people, day to day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I'd love, since we've opened up the conversation about the term apartheid, to dwell there. I mean, again, the ways that you help bring this conversation into dialogue with South Africa, I'd love to go there a little bit. And I guess I want to combine it with an element of your book. I mean, you spoke beautifully about the book of Joshua, actually. You said a lot of texts. It's a lot of Jewish texts all over your book. It's delightful, and it means that people who often like to criticize the Jewish left is like, they don't know Jewish tradition. It's impossible to do that. They have to come up with other ones for your book.
And they will.
Yes, they will.
Oh, they will. Yeah. The book of Joshua, I think it's really worth exploring. I mean, I won't say too much about what you say in the book. I'd love to hear what you brought in the book about how Joshua very clearly is this story of Jewish conquest of non-Jews. And at one point that was stated explicitly, right, and we sort of stopped saying that explicitly. Right. I actually want to shout to a past episode of ours with Rachel Haverlock. Yes. I mean, she's a fantastic scholar exploring the book of Joshua specifically. And what she writes about and what she spoke on our podcast about is that the book of Joshua actually, it ends up in a place where there is interaction between, I mean, we could say Jews is kind of anachronistic, but what Judeans, right. Israelites, whatever, and the Canaanite, the many tribes that were there before and actually continued to be there even after this initial conquest. And we don't talk about that because the rah-rah military war thing is kind of what people think about with the book of Joshua actually entering. I always find it euphemistic. People say entering the land, quote unquote. It's going to war. Like when we talk about the 12 spies not wanting to enter the land, that doesn't mean that they didn't want to like do a tourist trip. They didn't want to go to war. But Joshua has this implicit story, not so explicit, of we actually will continue to hang out with these people after a lot of violence. Right. I bring that up because apartheid and South Africa, you speak about how people's notions before it fell were that equality for black people would mean the destruction of white people. In the same way people talk about, like, if there's equal rights for Palestinians in this land, Jews will be, they don't always say Jews will all die. Right. Frequently they say Jews will be like into forced exile. And sometimes they're sort of blurred together. But like, at the very least, terrible, traumatic, awful things.
It's almost like people's minds go blank. It's just too frightening to even imagine what that would be like.
Yeah. And so I'll put it right back to you. Just like the book of Joshua has this different piece we don't always emphasize. How can we just diagnostically, what's happening with how people related to South Africa before and after the shifts, and how might we go about it differently?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, point I wanted to make about the book of Joshua is in the mainstream Jewish discourse, I feel like the way in which people imagine the ancient history of Jews in their relationship to the land of Israel is that we were always there. Therefore, people get really upset when Palestinians say they're indigenous or that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, because the idea is, no, we were indigenous, we were always there, right? It's actually interesting because if you look at the Hebrew Bible, that's not exactly the story that's being told, right? First of all, Abraham is not from there. I mean, that's the whole point. Lech lecha, right? He's told to go there by God. He's from somewhere else. And then the patriarch says, don't stay very long there, right? And then the Jews become a kind of a nation in Egypt in slavery. And then the Torah is the story of the rest of the Torah is the wandering through the desert. And then when the Torah ends at the beginning of the second part of the Hebrew Bible, you have the story of Joshua, which is the beginning of the conquest of the land. And so what I found interesting about this is that this story of the conquest of the land is generally, I noticed, in mainstream American Jewish discourse, not discussed. It kind of undermines the idea that Jews were always there, and it also undermines the notion of Jews as victims, that I find people are very comfortable talking about the destruction of the temple and expulsion of Jews in 70 CE with the destruction of the temple and after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, because that fits within the story of victimhood. But the story of Joshua and the conquest, now again, whether any of these things actually happened historically or not, or whether someone named Joshua, that's really not the point, right? The point is these are stories that help us think about who we are. I find that the story of Joshua and the story of conquest gets basically erased, just like the end of the book of Esther gets erased, because it doesn't fit within the victimhood frame. But the early Zionists loved the book of Joshua, right? And you were talking about Rachel Haverlock. She talks about how David Ben-Gurion basically creates this study group where all of the great and the good of the new state in the 1950s are literally studying the book of Joshua, right? They're naming battles from 1948, Operation Bin Nun, right? Because they're very proud.
That's Joshua's son of Nun, for context. Yeah.
Joshua Bin Nun, right? That's his name, right? Joshua, son of Nun. So they are celebrating this notion of conquest, which is connected to the fact that, I always chuckle a little bit when people get so upset that Zionism is called colonialism, because early Zionists called them Jabotinsky, Herzl. These people use these terms all the time for the same reason they were comfortable with the book of Joshua. They didn't see the notion of conquest if you had a purpose, in this Joshua, a religious purpose or a civilizational purpose. They didn't see that as a bad thing. It's only we see it as a bad thing, and it contradicts our victimhood narrative. On the South Africa point, I sometimes feel that Jews, we often think that we are inclined to see Palestinian equality as equating to Jewish genocide, to the genocide of Jews, or at the very least, the mass oppression of Jews. And I think oftentimes that's assumed to be because of our particularly traumatic history. It's very typical for groups of people who have become accustomed to legal supremacy to view equality as tantamount to their oppression. If you look at, in South Africa, this was taken for granted. It was considered obvious that a black government would leave white people in grave danger. I quote Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader of Northern Ireland, who calls the Good Friday Accords, which give Catholics political equality, he calls it a prelude to genocide. Throughout the 19th century and the 20th century in the United States, white Southerners are saying either we white people are going to be on top or we're going to be the slaves. My point is, it's typical to imagine equality as, and even today, I would say, in Donald Trump's America, part of what Donald Trump is exploiting is the notion that if America moves towards a genuinely multiracial democracy, that the people who used to be on top, white, straight Christian men, are now going to be on bottom. And that's a very typical fear for people to have. And so I wanted to try to suggest that other people have had these fears too, and that those fears haven't necessarily come true, because I actually, as a general rule, again, obviously I can't predict the future, different circumstances are different. I'm of the general belief that when you inflict less violence on people, you are actually likely to receive less violence yourself.
Another piece of your book that I think we've hinted at, but I'd love to tackle directly, you have a chapter title that if people didn't have the context, they'd think it's a typo. It's the new anti-Semitism. They might think you wrote the word twice and it's a mistake. It's
right.
not. Can you talk to us here about how anti-Semitism plays in? I don't want anybody to listen to this episode or this unit and say, Well, they're just blind to anti-Semitism. How have understandings of anti-Semitism shifted in the U.S. over time? And not only shifted like passive voice, how have they been shifted by conscious actors?
Yes. So the argument of this chapter, and this is, look, not unique to me, other people have told this story, is that in the middle of the 20th century, the organized American Jewish community tended to see anti-Semitism as deeply intertwined with other forms of bigotry, as a kind of illiberal, authoritarian instinct, which they generally associated with the political right. And so that's kind of was the backdrop for the American Jewish community's involvement in the civil rights movement, which is essentially to say, if Black people win their struggle for equality, because anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are intertwined, those forces of segregation and reaction in the United States also threaten Jews. What happened starting in the early 1970s is that the Civil Rights Acts have been passed, and the left globally, and to some degree in the United States, is becoming more critical, even hostile to Israel after the 1967 war. And so you start to see, and the Soviet Union has become more hostile and more critical. And so you start to see all of this criticism from the left of Israel. This produces this discourse called the new anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism says, it used to be that anti-Semitism was mostly coming from the right, but now it's kind of ambidextrous, that there's this new anti-Semitism which is just as dangerous, just as strong on the left. But the difference is it's not really focusing on individual Jews, it's focusing on the Jewish state as a kind of stand-in, right? So some people use the phrase, Israel is the Jew of the nation. So essentially that Israel collectively is the way you express your anti-Semitism against the Jewish state rather than necessarily against individual Jews. And so part of the chapter, and this, I would say this notion has remained very dominant in establishment Jewish discourse ever since. So literally the things that these leaders of the ADL were saying when they wrote this book, The New Anti-Semitism in the 1970s, are very similar to what ADL head Jonathan Greenblatt says today, where he'll basically say, we face two comparable threats, one from basically white supremacists and the other from anti-Zionists. What I try to argue in the book is that there is anti-Semitism on the left. The Soviet Union engaged in anti-Semitism in the 1970s for its own reasons. It's clear if you look back at the record. There are expressions of anti-Semitism that exist in anti-Zionist spaces today. There are tropes about Jews as all-powerful, Jews as malevolent, that can weave their way into leftist discourse. These things are all true. It is not true that anti-Semitism, as we have traditionally defined it, hostility to Jews is equal on the left as on the right. That if you look at the academic research, that the best academic research we have on this, and I particularly cite the work of Eitan Hirsch at Tufts and Laura Roden at Harvard, but if you get away from the ADL, which is an advocacy organization, and you actually look at academics, you find that actually anti-Semitic attitudes are far, far higher on the American right. And the point I try to make is that that's not really surprising. We would not expect anti-Black racist views or misogynist views or anti-trans views or anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim views to be equal on the left and the right, because the right, by its nature, tends to idealize a previous era and mythologize a previous era in history in which there were clearer hierarchies between groups that were on top and groups that were on the bottom. And so the fact that the left, which is more equality oriented, exhibits lower rates of anti-Semitism as well as anti-Black racism, homophobia, et cetera, not zero, but lower, is actually what you would expect. And that the other groups, the NAACP, does not go around and saying we are equally menaced by anti-Black racism from the left and the right, because they understand that the left and the right have a different relationship to the notion of human equality.
So I want to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier. Looking at the various examples like South Africa and Northern Ireland, like it turned out that these fears were unwarranted and actually the Parade of Horribles didn't happen when the underlying situation was addressed.
Right.
And you said something like, well, we don't know what will happen in Israel, Palestine. And I think that there are people who would be listening to that who would say, actually, we do know what will happen if that happens. October 7th, we saw it. And I want to give you an opportunity to address that, because I know that your theory is that it wouldn't happen because, your theory is that October 7th only happened because of the oppression and because the Palestinians didn't have hope and whatever. But the reality is, I think we could all agree that we don't really know. It puts me in the mind of, my college economics class where we learned about the endowment effect, right, which is this idea in economics that they've discovered. I mean, this is through science. This is not speculation. That when you set up a transaction in a certain way that actually it's kind of the same transaction either way, it turns out that people are much more nervous about the potential to lose what they already have than they are about the potential not to gain something that they haven't yet gained. And so the reality of the situation right now, like it or not, is that Israel has this state and this position and the Palestinians do not. And it's like human nature that the one that has the power, the one that has it, won't want to give it up. And so my question is a practical one, which is really like, given all that, and given the endowment effect and the fact that October 7th has kind of heightened the fears that people had, that we do know what will happen, realistically, like, what are they supposed to do?
Right. So the first thing I want to say something about this word power, because I find often the way it gets used to be a little bit misleading, because I think people use power as a euphemism for supremacy. I don't think that people under conditions of legal equality don't have any power, right? It's not like white Southerners didn't have any power once Black people got the right to vote. It's certainly not the case that white South Africans don't have power. They actually have a lot of power, Protestants in Northern Ireland. What they don't have is legal supremacy. I actually think, frankly, if you look at post-apartheid South Africa and you look at post-apartheid United States, or you look at Northern Ireland, the dirty little secret is that groups that have historically had legal supremacy tend to maintain their privilege even for a long period of time after the legal supremacy ends, right? Because of the inherited effects of basically this privilege that lasted generations. I mean, look at the impact of generational wealth in the United States on the lives of white and Black Americans. It's frustrating to me when people say October 7th is what would happen if you had equality between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, because that's not the context in which October 7th happened. October 7th happened in a very particular context, and I really spent an entire chapter trying to basically explain what I think happened in the decades leading up to October 7th. You have a situation in which Palestinians are living without basic freedom. And Palestinians in Gaza in particular are living in what Human Rights Watch calls an open-air prison, right, which the UN says is unlivable. My friend Mohammed Shahada, who I quote in the book, talks about how every single person he knew growing up in Gaza had contemplated suicide because the unemployment rate for university graduates was 70%, that this was the condition in which people were living, and that people were trying to find ways out of this. And they came up with a number of things, right? Boycotts and sanctions was an effort. The Great March of Return, which was a largely peaceful, nonviolent march, was an effort. The Palestinian Authority's strategy of collaboration with Israel, which is to say, we're going to work with you to try to prevent violence against Israelis in hopes of convincing you can be trusted with a state. All of this failed. Not just failed, it was defeated by Israel. And so, again, Mohammed literally talks about the conversations he had with people in Hamas who said, none of your efforts have succeeded. Look at where we are. We're going to use violence. We're going to break out and we're going to commit this act of violence, and we're going to try to see if that gets us any better place. Again, this is not to excuse for a second the horror of what was done on October 7th, but again and again in movements of nationalist movements of people who lack rights, when nonviolence fails, people turn to violence. When Nelson Mandela turned the African National Congress towards violent resistance, he said explicitly, our nonviolent efforts had failed. The IRA gained power in Northern Ireland after civil rights style protest had been crushed by the British. So this, I think, is the critical context. And one of the points I make is to think about Palestinian citizens, who we often call Arab Israelis, versus Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I'm often struck that people will say that they think if you go and meet with Palestinians in the West Bank, or let alone Gaza, you're taking your life in your own hands. Those people will kill you the first chance they get, right? That's the perception. I think it's actually not really true. Amira Haas, Sarah Roy, there have been Israelis, the Jews, other Jews who've lived in Gaza for many years, but that's the perception. And yet those same people, they go to the pharmacy, they're given prescription medicines by a Palestinian pharmacist, because the majority of the pharmacists in Israel are Arab Israelis. A huge percentage of the nurses, the doctors, they go in their most vulnerable circumstances and they put themselves at the mercy of Palestinians. Those Palestinians are not fundamentally different than the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It's one people. They just happen to end up on the different side of a border that was created in 1948. Why is it that Palestinian citizens are less dangerous? And my argument is it's because they have the vote. Even though they're discriminated against, they have some mechanism to make their grievances heard by a government. And when people do that, the quote unquote, to use your economic, the market for violence goes down, because most people in any circumstance would much prefer to try to agitate for their interests and improve their lives through nonviolent methods rather than things that are going to get them killed.
On this point about, Jewish supremacy, that's what we're talking about to some degree. And I really appreciate the distinction you brought between supremacy and power. There's a piece of your book that doesn't take up a ton of real estate, but that really got me whirling, which was around the name Israel. There's a conflation that operates in conversations about Israel and its quote-unquote existence, right? Like people talk about right to exist and right. Israel's right to exist. Now, sometimes what that might mean in a conversation is a nation state in that place existing. If that's what you think, then arguing for a binational one-state solution that would still be a state in that place, like that's actually not upending anything.
Right.
If that's what existence, quote-unquote, means. Often, what is really meant is not just like sort of any existence, but the existence of a state where Jews have particular, whether we say privileges or rights that others don't have. And that's a challenging thing to say to people who want to believe that there is equality there. But like by law, this is not like a controversial statement. Like it is codified into actual legal system that Jews have certain rights that non-Jews don't. We have not even just in Israel, like the three of us in this room have a right to return, quote unquote, to that place that Palestinians don't have, even though they may have been born there.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious just about that word Israel. I think it points to that, because if a state was going to exist that was actually equal, it would probably not be called that, because Israel is like a tribal. It relates to a guy from the Hebrew Bible, Jacob, also known as Israel. Like, what do we do with all that?
When people say, does Israel have a right to exist? I think what they really mean is Israel have a right to exist as a country in which Jews are in charge. Because there will be some state there, or could potentially be two states. But the question is saying, what they really mean is this political system, this regime has a right to exist, right? And my argument is actually, and then they say Israel is the only country in the world that we would question its right to exist. And I would say, no, that's not true, actually. That we challenge the political systems, the regimes of many countries we don't like. We don't believe that the Communist Party has the right to run China and run Cuba and run North Korea. We don't believe that Putin has the right to run Russia, that clerics have the right to run Iran, that Iran has the right to exist as a Muslim state. But part of the issue is that we don't think perhaps very much about the fact that the Jewish supremacy is built into the name of the country itself, because Israel is both the name of the country and it's also the name of the Jewish people. That's the name of our people, Israel. The name that Jacob was given after he wrestled with the angel. It's almost a little bit, it's almost like America was called Christian land. How do you think non-Christians would feel? Do they think they'd feel very equal? No. And in fact, the political system is built on this principle, that it's basically the land for Jews to be in charge. And that expresses itself in all kinds of different ways, but it suffuses the Israeli political system. So yes, for us to imagine a country based on equality, it would have to have a name that could express the identities of all of the people, whether that was Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel, or something else, right? But if you have a name which is exclusively the name of one ethno-religious group, how would we have felt growing up if America had a national anthem which spoke about Jesus Christ and a flag which had explicitly Christian symbols? We would probably be told, my mother would probably tell me, don't say that. That doesn't represent you. And so I think we should be able to understand a little better the way Palestinians might feel about living in a country called Israel.
So as we get close to the conclusion here, I want to go back to, I think I've been beating this drum for the whole conversation in certain ways, but I'm thinking very practically, and it's totally okay for you to answer to this question like, that's not my job, and that's not my role in this story. Actually, I would respect that a lot. What I'm struggling with is I just don't think people are convinced by facts and data. And I think that some people will read a book and have their minds changed, but most people won't. And like maybe in this story, you're just you're a facts and figures guy, and you write books but ultimately, I guess like you write like Martin Luther King led a bus boycott, or led a spiritual movement, Gandhi. I'm asking, like, maybe ultimately, like, and I'm really only talking about the Jews. I'm not talking about like who's going to lead the Palestinians. I'm saying who's going to lead the Jews where you hope they want to go. And it feels like there's like a spiritual need here rather than a intellectual need. And I'm just sort of wondering, when you think about, okay, how is the world going to be brought about that you think should be brought about? Like, what do you think is your role, and where do you think is someone else's role? And is there anyone else doing that role, and where can we find them?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think we're so far away from that. I think you were right. I think when I look at other systems of oppression and supremacy that have changed, what happens is that people in the group that is benefiting from this supremacy, at a certain point, some people in that group start to say, this isn't working for us anymore, that the costs are getting too high for us. We need to therefore be willing to reimagine and think about alternatives that we haven't had to think about and that we wouldn't be thinking about if things were still working for us, but they're not working for us, right? In South Africa, you basically had a kind of uprising that the government couldn't put down. And you had, when the banks in New York stopped rolling over South Africa's loans, South Africa faced serious economic crisis and cultural isolation. And some people in the elite started to think, oh, gosh, maybe we could give Black people the vote and somehow still like be okay. And then they started to have conversations and they began to imagine a different paradigm. We're very, very far away from that in this situation. But one of the reasons that I do believe that nonviolent pressure is important is I don't want Israeli Jews to die. I don't want people's minds to be changed at this cost of human suffering. But I do think that people need to face some tangible consequences if they're going to rethink things. And so, maybe it is the prospect of Israeli former soldiers and Israeli commanders realizing that they can't necessarily fly to Portugal for that holiday anymore or go shopping in London because they face the prospect of arrest. Or maybe it is because that the BDS movement plus Israel's economic terms leads that say, okay, Dell and these Oracle are not investing here anymore, that we're actually starting to face real tangible consequences, and that perhaps that could create voices in Israel that would say, you know what, this isn't working for us. We could imagine a different way of being safe and flourishing. Now, the separate part of that is, of course, the question of Palestinians, that Palestinians don't have a united leadership, and they don't have a leadership that's offering a vision right now. What made Mandela effective was, on one hand, the militancy of his pressure. He refused to denounce violence, even when the government was begging him to renounce violence. But he also held out a vision of a country of collective liberation. And so my dream, I don't know if we'll ever see it, would be a Palestinian leadership. And we have to allow that Palestinian leadership to form. Palestinians have to be able to have a process to choose their leaders. We can't choose their leaders for them. Those leaders will never be legitimate, right? Most of those leaders are now sitting in jail. But a Palestinian leadership that can go through a process that's legitimate, that hopefully can come up with a vision of collective liberation and pressure. And then maybe there's a role for some of us in the Jewish community also to contribute to that internal Jewish conversation and to say, no, let's imagine together other ways in which we can not just survive, but flourish, that don't rely on supremacy. And let's look at models we have from other parts of the world where other people were able to do that.
So let me ask you something, though, because I think a lot of people, when they hear, let's say the Jewish left talking about the various criticisms of Israel and the various hopes for the future that aren't like what they think should be the hopes of the future, they worry very much that they're asking Israel to roll over right away and everybody's going to be killed. And you're actually saying something different. I hear you to be saying something different. You're saying this is a process. You said a few times, we're far from it. This is going to take a lot of time. And on the one hand, I hope that can be a bit of a lowering of the temperature to the folks so that they'll listen to what you're trying to say on the Jewish side. But I'm curious, like, where that leaves the Palestinians. Like, is it that the Palestinians are going to have to endure another decade or two of horrible lives? Is that maybe the reality that we have to just close our thinking with?
I hope it's not. If I try to be kind of brutally realistic and looking at the circumstances that I see them, to me, it's not just we face a situation in which Palestinians are kind of stuck living without basic human rights for many, many, many more years. But actually, I think it's considerably worse than that. When I look at what Israel's doing in Gaza, and even to some degree we're doing in the West Bank, it seems to me that the clearest understanding I can make of what Israel is doing is that I think it's following what we might call the kind of the American solution to the Palestinian problem. And when I say the American solution, I'm thinking about the 19th century American solution. to the problem of Native Americans, which is to essentially say, over a period of time, and it takes multiple decades, basically, you so fragment and destroy the population that it ceases to be able to operate politically at all and stops being a threat to you. The United States didn't go to the Mississippi River and say, great, let's have a two-state solution. The Native Americans can have everything west of the Mississippi. We continued that process until Native Americans were essentially, not every one of them was killed, but they were destroyed as a political entity. They were no longer a threat. And I think that it is completely conceivable that that is the direction that things head, whether it's mass expulsion into Egypt or whether it's just further. I mean, look at Gaza. It was unlivable according to the United Nations on October 6th. Now, Israel's plans seem to be to basically bar Palestinians from the northern part of Gaza, to concentrate them in an even much smaller area where they were already massively overcrowded, be fragmented within that area, lacking access to the most fertile agricultural areas, right? This is a recipe, it seems to me, for destruction and death. That is, I think, the way we are going. But I hope that somehow a moral movement around the world that includes Jews and includes people from all different backgrounds, that is in the spirit of the great movements for human freedom, can turn that around.
So a closing question, and this harkens back to when I first met you, which was through the Open Hillel ecosystem. And it's in your book, too. I mean, what's fascinating about American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine is that it is so much more heightened than American Jewish discourse on, say, God. And I say heightened in both senses. Like, I think it's more intensified, and it's also like more elevated and spiritualized to some degree. Like there's actually, and we've talked about this on the show, there's less talk about God than I would like. And I say that not as like a devout monotheist who is slamming my prayer book and saying people don't love Yud He Vav He. And like, that's not, I've talked on the show, I'm like a pantheist. I would like to talk about God from a notion of elevating other theologies from Jewish tradition that people don't know about. I think that it's appropriate and important to name that, going back to Open Hillel, it's normal and accepted that an organization like Hillel International has standards of partnership on Israel, where if you think X, Y, or Z about Israel-Palestine, you are not permitted to partner with that organization. But there are no such policies for standards of partnership on God or standards of partnership on any particular holiday or on kashrut, on Shabbat, like none of it exists. And it points to the ways in which, and you know, I'm borrowing this from the folks who made Israelism, and I'm on their advisory board, but like the ways in which Israel belief, and I'm saying that phrase consciously, I get that it sounds like a kind of idolatry, that Israel belief has supplanted other forms of Jewish belief. And so as a closing note, I'd love for you to help us understand what's happening there and maybe propose some alternative paths from treating Israel in that kind of deified way.
Yes, I think you're exactly right, that Israel has become the kind of the state, and, you know, not just support of the state, but I think often a kind of worship of the state has become the kind of religion of much of the organized American Jewish community. So as you say, if you have a group of students who want to create a group called, you know, Jews Against God or Jews Against Kashrut, there's no rule that says they can't be an affiliated member of Hillel, right?
And there aren't groups called that, but there are Jewish atheist groups. There are Jewish groups that have pepperoni pizza.
Hillel would actually be chasing them down. Like they would love to have them.
Yeah, I say this as a former Hillel International board member.
No, they'd be great.
Yeah, I say this as a former Hillel director. We would love that group.
Hillel says very explicitly, whether you keep Shabbat or not, basically, we don't care. You're just Jews, right? Which is, again, from a traditional Jewish religious perspective, is a strange thing to say, right? Shabbat is like pretty important. But if you say we're Jews against Zionism or Jews against Israel, right? No. Then you've really uttered the ineffable name of God, and everyone runs out of the shul screaming, right? So it's like, yes, and I think you mentioned the word idolatry, and that's where the book ends, really, or in the last chapter, with the discussion of idolatry. Not unique to me, but some ideas that I took from Yeshayahu Leibovitz in particular. But it is very dangerous to invest states with a kind of sacred quality. That Leibovitz's point was, Heschel made the point that there's only one thing created in the image of God, and that's the human being. And so states are instruments for the protection and flourishing of human life. Not just Jewish life, but all life, because Torah doesn't begin with Jews, right? The first characters that we meet in Torah are not Jews. They're universal human beings. And God created them too. If one thinks about Israel from that perspective, our relationship with Israel is as an instrument for yes, the protection and flourishing of the Jews who live under its control, but also the protection and flourishing of the Palestinians who live under its control. And half the people under its control are Palestinian. And I think that what the organized American Jewish community has done in this kind of state worship is actually part of a global phenomenon. I think this is part of what Trumpism is too. This notion, there's so many American Christians who seem now to basically have forgotten the idea that Christianity involves any moral obligation to the human being, regardless of what passport they hold, but to basically have turned America into their God, right? So if you're on the wrong side of this border, you are nothing. Or if you look at the way in which Narendra Modi has turned Hinduism into this kind of ethno-nationalist, kind of supremacist idea in which the empowering of the state. These are really, really dangerous things. Idolatry is a very, very, very grave sin in Jewish tradition, and it's often connected to the brutalization and a degradation of the human being. To me, this is what we are engaged in here in our relationship with Israel, a kind of idolatry that leads us to believe that Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state is absolute, but the rights of individual children in Gaza to exist is relatively insignificant. And I think that's where you get to this situation we are now of mass starvation and mass killing.
Oof. That's maybe not the pleasant note to end a conversation on, but I think it's the right one today. So I really want to say thank you to bringing a depth of Torah to this conversation, and also reminding us that it's not just about our explorations of Jewish text and tradition. It's also about the stakes of real human lives, Palestinian, Israeli, and otherwise. So thank you, Peter Beinart, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future, especially in the coming weeks as we continue this unit exploring American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. A reminder that Peter Beinart's book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, is available just about anywhere books are found. You can find a link to purchase it in our show notes, and also your local bookstore, online, etc. We hope that you'll read it in full. It opens up so many important conversations for our time. As we close, we also hope that you'll be in touch with us, and you can do so via any of the following platforms. There's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Those are @JudaismUnbound. You can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, to access show notes for this episode, other resources, all sorts of goodies. And you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We're also appreciative if you're able to support us financially via either a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift. And you can do either of those via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.